Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, March 10th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside is looking pleasant today, with a high of 72.8 degrees and a low reaching 46.3 degrees, making for a perfect day to be out and about. On today's program, we will investigate the complications surrounding the recent school strike in Iran, specifically looking at how artificial intelligence combined with potentially outdated intelligence gathering may have influenced the event. We will also dive into the legal landscape, discussing exactly why several states have decided to reject the federal settlement concerning Live Nation. Beyond these major stories, we will cover a variety of other pressing news topics from around the world. All this and more on today's episode of Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a story that has shaken people around the world. 10 days ago, a missile struck a girls' elementary school in southern Iran, killing as many as 180 people, most of them children. The investigation into what happened has now reached what many are calling a turning point. Ethan covers national security for us and has been following this from the start. Ethan, take us back to February 28th. What do we know about that morning?
So February 28th was a Saturday, which is actually the first day of the school week in Iran. Classes had just started at the Shajara Tayyebe Girls Elementary School in the city of Minab, down in Hormozgan province near the Strait of Hormuz. That same morning, the United States and Israel launched the opening wave of a joint military campaign the Pentagon calls Operation Epic Fury. According to the Associated Press and UNICEF, the strike killed between 165 and 175 people. More than 160 of them were schoolgirls, mostly between the ages of 7 and 12, along with roughly 14 teachers and staff.
The United Nations has called this the single deadliest civilian incident in the entire conflict so far. Early on, the White House said Iran was to blame. Has that story held up?
It really hasn't. The administration's initial claim was that an inaccurate Iranian missile misfired and hit the school. But independent investigations have moved sharply in the other direction. Bellingcat, working with the New York Times, CNN, and BBC Verify, analyzed what's being called a 7-second video from the scene, along with other footage. Weapons experts, including Trevor Ball and Jeffrey Lewis of Middlebury College, identified the munition as a Tomahawk cruise missile. And the critical detail here is that the United States is the only party in this conflict currently known to operate Tomahawks.
So do we know whether any Tomahawks were actually fired from that area on that day?
We do. U.S. Central Command confirmed that the USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that's part of the USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, was positioned within range and fired Tomahawks on February 28th. That's not disputed. What analysts from NPR and Al Jazeera have also noted is that satellite imagery from Planet Labs suggests the school was hit during a rapid succession of precision strikes, sometimes called a triple tap. Smoke was already rising from the vicinity when a subsequent missile slammed into a structure within the same compound, and the school was caught in the blast radius.
So this wasn't a case of one missile going wildly off course. It sounds like the school was actually targeted. Was it deliberate?
Everything we're learning suggests it was not intentional, but was instead a catastrophic targeting error. Internal Pentagon communications leaked to Reuters, CBS News, and The Washington Post reveal that the school sits immediately adjacent to the Sayed al-Shuhada IRGC naval base. And here's the key piece. Forensic analysis of satellite data shows the school building was actually part of that military compound until 2016. That's when it was walled off and converted for civilian use. Preliminary assessments suggest U.S. targeting folders, the data packages used to plan strikes, hadn't been updated in roughly a decade.
A decade of outdated intelligence. And I understand there's also an artificial intelligence component to this?
That's right, and it may be the most consequential part of the story going forward. The Washington Post reports that the Pentagon used something called the Maven Smart System, which is the military's AI-powered targeting platform. It reportedly incorporates Palantir technology and Anthropic's Claude AI. The concern is that this system ingested that same outdated data, showing the building as part of the military base. Because the AI is designed to compress decision-making time, The school was apparently flagged and prioritized as a high-value military target. That left human operators with insufficient time to verify whether the building was still being used for military purposes or had become a school full of children.
So the AI basically fast-tracked a strike based on old information, and nobody caught the mistake in time?
That's the picture emerging from these leaks, yes. The speed that makes these systems attractive to the military is exactly what made this error so deadly. There simply wasn't enough time built into the process for a human to look at that target and say, wait, let's double-check what this building is today. And that raises enormous questions about how much autonomy these AI systems have in real-world combat operations.
Now, President Trump weighed in just yesterday, on March 9th. What did he say?
The president denied U.S. responsibility entirely. He claimed, without providing evidence, that Iran possesses what he called generic Raytheon-manufactured Tomahawk missiles, and likely struck its own school. Experts have pushed back hard on that. Analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies point out that Tomahawk missiles are strictly regulated and only operated by the U.S., the United Kingdom, and a handful of close allies like Japan and Australia. Iran's own missile arsenal is reverse-engineered from Soviet-era designs, and those weapons are visually distinct from a Tomahawk, so the claim doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
What about the Pentagon itself? Are they echoing the president's denial?
There's a real disconnect. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed an investigation is underway, but he's taken a hardline public stance. He described Operation Epic Fury as the, quote, most lethal and precise in history, end quote, and said the U.S. would not be bound by, quote, stupid rules of engagement, end quote, or, quote, international institutions, end quote. But behind the scenes, it's a different tone. Anonymous officials told the Associated Press that the strike was, quote, likely American, end quote. And the Pentagon has officially launched what's called a Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Assessment. That step is typically reserved for incidents where U.S. culpability is specifically suspected.
So publicly they're denying it, but internally they're investigating it as their own strike. How is the rest of the world reacting?
The global response has been intense. News 8000 and Crossroads Today have reported protests in cities including Los Angeles, New York, London, Baghdad, Berlin, and Istanbul. The crowds have been mixed in their aims. Some protesters have expressed support for regime change in Iran, but the overwhelming majority are focused on condemning the civilian deaths and demanding accountability. 160-plus children is a number that crosses every political and cultural line.
And from a legal standpoint, does it matter whether this was an accident or intentional?
It absolutely matters, but not in the way you might expect. Janina Dill, who's an international law expert at Oxford University, has stated that even if the school was hit due to misidentification, the failure to verify the target constitutes a, quote, very serious violation of international law, end quote. Under the laws of armed conflict, the obligation to distinguish between military and civilian targets is fundamental. You can't just say we didn't mean to. Both the United Nations and UNESCO have condemned the strike as a potential war crime. The word potential is doing some heavy lifting there, but the legal exposure is significant.
Remind us why this military operation is happening in the first place. What's the broader context?
According to Forbes and The Guardian, Operation Epic Fury was triggered by the collapse of nuclear diplomacy with Iran in February of this year. The stated goals are preventing an Iranian nuclear breakout, destroying its ballistic missile arsenal, and supporting domestic regime change following internal protests inside Iran. Israel is running a parallel campaign they call Operation Roaring Lion. The Manab school strike happened in the very first wave of attacks, which makes it all the more devastating, because it set the tone for how this campaign would be perceived worldwide.
As of this morning, March 10th, has anyone been able to independently reach the school site?
No, and that's a major frustration for investigators. No independent agency has been able to access the Manab site due to the ongoing war and an internet blackout in parts of Iran. Pentagon spokesperson Captain Timothy Hawkins says the military is continuing its internal civilian harm assessment, but a final report has not been released. So right now, the evidence we have comes from leaked documents, satellite imagery, and that crucial video analysis. The full picture is still coming together, but with each day, the evidence is pointing more and more clearly toward a U.S. Tomahawk.
A story with enormous implications. Ethan, thank you for walking us through it.
Thanks, Grace.
We'll continue to follow that investigation. Still ahead, our second story this morning. We've got a major development in the fight over concert ticket prices and who controls live music in this country. The Department of Justice announced a deal yesterday with Live Nation Entertainment, but not everyone's on board. Chloe has been following this one closely. Chloe, what exactly did federal regulators agree to here?
So yesterday, March 9th, the DOJ announced a tentative settlement with Live Nation, the parent company of Ticketmaster. This was supposed to resolve that big antitrust lawsuit the government filed back in 2024. According to PBS News and the Associated Press, the deal came together just 1 week into what was expected to be a lengthy trial in a Manhattan federal court. The DOJ is calling it a historic win for competition, but that framing is already drawing fierce pushback.
What are the main terms of this settlement?
There are several pieces. First, Live Nation agreed to set up a $280 million settlement fund to cover civil penalties and damages to the states. They also have to divest ownership or exclusive booking rights for 13 amphitheaters in major markets across the country. And there's a fee cap that requires Ticketmaster to limit service charges to 15% of a ticket's face value at Live Nation-controlled venues. On paper, it sounds significant, but the details tell a more complicated story.
$280 million is a lot of money. Is it enough to actually change anything?
That's the big question. And most analysts say no. Fox Business and CBS News both report that the amount represents roughly 4 days of Live Nation's 2025 revenue. So for a company of that size, it's essentially a rounding error. It's the kind of penalty that gets absorbed into the cost of doing business rather than fundamentally changing behavior. Consumer advocates have been quick to point that out.
You mentioned 13 amphitheaters being divested. Do we know which ones?
We have a pretty good idea. AP News and NPR News report the targeted locations include venues in Austin, likely the Germania Insurance Amphitheater, as well as Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Syracuse, and the New York, New Jersey area. We're talking about places like Riverbend Music Center, the St. Joseph's Health Amphitheater, and possibly Jones Beach or PNC Bank Arts Center. These are big outdoor venues that host major summer tours, so losing them would matter. But 13 amphitheaters out of Live Nation's massive portfolio is still a fraction of their footprint.
And what about that fee cap? 15% sounds like it could help fans.
It sounds good on the surface, but antitrust experts have already spotted a significant loophole. The Guardian and Business Insider report that because Live Nation owns both the venues and the promotion arm, it can legally shift costs into other categories. Think facility fees, processing fees, handling charges. None of those are regulated by this settlement. So the cap applies to one narrow slice of what you pay, but the total out-the-door price for a concert ticket could stay exactly the same. John Quokka, who's a well-known antitrust scholar, has been vocal about this kind of structural problem.
So the sticker price might not actually change for the person buying the ticket?
Exactly right. You might see the line item labeled service fee go down, but then a new line pops up or an existing one grows. It's a shell game, critics say. And that's one of the core reasons so many people are calling this a sweetheart deal rather than a genuine remedy.
The deal also requires Live Nation to open its ticketing technology to competitors. How would that work?
Under the settlement, rival platforms like SeatGeek and StubHub would be allowed to sell up to 50% of tickets for certain shows on their own systems. Live Nation also has to make its ticketing technology accessible to those competitors. There's also an 8-year extension of the original 2010 consent decree, which is supposed to stop Live Nation from retaliating against venues that choose competing promoters or ticketing services. But again, we've seen consent decrees before with this company, and compliance has been a persistent issue.
Speaking of that 2010 consent decree, hasn't that already been in place for years? Why didn't it work?
That's precisely the argument the states are making. The 2010 decree was put in place when Live Nation and Ticketmaster merged, and it was supposed to prevent exactly the kind of market dominance we're seeing now. The states say it failed completely. Live Nation only grew more powerful, locked up more venues, and tightened its grip on artist management and promotion. So extending a framework that didn't work the first time is not inspiring confidence among regulators at the state level.
And that brings us to the states. How many are rejecting this deal?
As of this morning, 26 states plus the District of Columbia have officially rejected the DOJ settlement. We're talking about heavyweights like California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. ABC News and Fox 12 Oregon report that these holdout states want something far more aggressive. They're pushing for a full structural breakup of Live Nation and Ticketmaster, not just behavioral tweaks.
What's their legal argument for a breakup?
It rests on three main pillars. They allege illegal tying, meaning Live Nation forces venues to use Ticketmaster as a condition for getting big-name tours. They also claim exclusionary conduct, arguing the company uses its market power to shut out independent promoters entirely. And then there's the failure of the 2010 decree itself, which they say proves that anything short of a breakup won't work. It's a muscular legal strategy, and New York Attorney General Letitia James is leading the charge.
What has James said specifically about the settlement?
PBS News reports she characterized the deal as a, quote, failure of the justice system, end quote. She and other attorneys general argue it doesn't address what they call the flywheel monopoly. That's the self-reinforcing loop where Live Nation uses its dominance in artist management and promotion to pressure venues into exclusive Ticketmaster contracts. The venues feel they have no choice because Live Nation controls access to the biggest tours. So the monopoly feeds itself, and the states say this settlement leaves that engine completely intact.
There was also some drama in the courtroom itself. What happened with the judge?
This was remarkable. U.S. District Judge Arun Subramanian was clearly blindsided by the timing. He called the late-night disclosure of the deal, quote, entirely unacceptable, end quote, and described it as, quote, absolute disrespect, end quote, toward the court and the jury. Keep in mind, this trial had already begun. Jurors had been seated and were hearing evidence. So for a settlement to suddenly appear in the middle of proceedings without proper notice to the bench was extraordinary.
So what did the judge do about it?
This morning at 8:30 Eastern, he held a pivotal hearing and ordered Live Nation CEO Michael Rapino and DOJ officials to come explain the lack of transparency. He has not dismissed the jury, which is a crucial detail. Instead, he's instructed the 12-member panel to return next Monday, March 16th, to resume the trial on behalf of those 26 non-settling states. So the federal settlement and the state lawsuit are now running on parallel tracks in the same courtroom.
How does the federal settlement actually get finalized from here?
It goes through what's called the Tunney Act process. That requires a 60-day public comment period, where anyone, consumers, rival companies, advocacy groups, can submit objections. After that, the judge has to make a determination that the deal serves the public interest before it can take effect. Consumer advocacy groups and rival ticketing platforms are expected to flood the DOJ with objections during that window. So this is far from a done deal even on the federal side.
If the states win their case, could Live Nation still be broken up, even with this settlement in place?
Absolutely. The state litigation is separate, and if those 26 states and D.C. prevail at trial, a court could order a full structural breakup regardless of what the federal government agreed to. That's the real vulnerability for Live Nation here. They may have struck a deal with Washington, but more than half the country's attorneys general are still coming after them with the heaviest legal tool available.
Any sense of who might buy those 13 amphitheaters if the divestiture goes through?
Newsday reports that industry analysts see AEG, that's the Anschutz Entertainment Group, and Oakview Group as the most logical buyers. Both already have significant footprints in live entertainment and the infrastructure to operate large outdoor venues. But nothing's confirmed yet, and honestly, the ongoing state litigation could reshape the entire picture before any sale is finalized.
So where does all of this leave concert goers right now?
In limbo, honestly. Federal regulators say they've made cracks in the monopoly, but the holdout states insist only a total dissolution of the 2010 merger will restore real competition. The Tunney Act review will take months. The state trial resumes next week. And none of the settlement's consumer protections kick in until the deal is approved. So for anyone buying concert tickets this summer, nothing changes yet. The fight over who controls live music in America is very much still on.
Chloe, thank you for breaking all of that down for us.
Happy to do it.
Here are some other headlines. President Donald Trump is making a Billy bold move, threatening to put his legislative pen in the freezer. On March 10, 2026, the president announced he will withhold his signature from all future laws until Congress passes the Save America Act. This voter-fied plan, which already cleared the House, seeks to box out mail-in balloting almost entirely, leaving only small mail slots for military and disabled voters. Critics are checking out of the idea, warning that requiring a passport or birth certificate to register could disenfranchise 21,300,000 eligible citizens. With the Senate caught in a filibuster deadlock, the government is looking more frozen than a Florida popsicle, potentially upending systems in all mail states like Oregon and California just months before the 2026 midterms. Speaking of being out in the cold, the Department of Homeland Security is currently facing a partial shutdown due to a legislative ice age over those very same voting and immigration reforms. It is a borderline catastrophe for employers. A new report shows 75% of large firms are facing staffingitis thanks to intensified enforcement. On the bright side, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is delivering a tax-tastic $160 billion in credits, potentially boosting average refunds by 44%. However, your wallet might still feel a crude awakening at the pump. Following military strikes in Iran, Brent crude has hit a slick $107 per barrel, and middle-income families are bracing for a premium headache as Affordable Care Act subsidies expire. In the Big Apple, a shattering plot was narrowly avoided. Two Pennsylvania teenagers, 18-year-old Amir Balat and 19-year-old Ibrahim Qayyumi, are facing federal charges after allegedly trying to turn a protest at Gracie Mansion into a blast from the past. They reportedly threw improvised explosives at an anti-Islam rally on March 7th, but luckily, their plan was a total dud as the devices failed to detonate. The suspects, who were reportedly ISIS-pired, aimed to outdo the 2013 Boston Marathon tragedy, but instead found themselves in a joint operation between the NYPD and the FBI. Across the pond at the United Nations, the debate over Afghanistan is getting sanction-heavy. China is calling for a lift on unilateral sanctions and the return of frozen assets to prevent an economic freefall, while Pakistan is warning the Taliban to curb their enthusiasm for cross-border militancy. Meanwhile, officials are worried about the Taliban's new tech-savvy side, using artificial intelligence and satellites for illegal activities. It is an AIII situation as the March 17th deadline for the UN mission looms. Finally, in Haiti, the situation is droning on in a tragic way. Reports show that security forces and private contractors have killed 1,243 people via drone strikes this past year, including 17 children. Prime Minister Alex Didier Fils-Aimé is flying solo as the sole executive, while gang coalitions like Viv Ansanam control 90% of the capital. With 5,700,000 people facing a famine-ished future and U.S. aid cut off, the country is in a desperate hiatus until the August 2026 elections. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.